Could you state your name and organisation for the purpose of the tribunal today? Thank you.
Yep, my name is Jonna Monaghan, and I'm representing Northern Ireland Women's European Platform.
That's great. Thanks very much. In your witness statement, you referred specifically to the issues that were made clear in the concluding observations of CEDAW in 2019, that legislation in Northern Ireland is, compared to other devolved nations in the UK, is falling behind, and the specific recommendation that Northern Ireland needs to be put on an equal footing with the other devolved administrations and jurisdictions. So what particular areas does that concern from your experience?
This is a wide-ranging issue, and it's something that the women's sector in Northern Ireland has been raising for quite some time. Specifically, and in particular, there's concern around legislation around violence against women and girls. You know, unlike Wales, there is no legislation around specifically on violence against women and girls, and we actually are the only part of the UK where there is no strategy on violence against women and girls. We have a gender neutral domestic violence strategy, and that there's been a campaign recently calling for a specific strategy, but the responses that we are getting from the Northern Ireland government is that that couldn't be done, because that would mean that they're not taking violence against men seriously. Now, there was just in March, following the Sarah Everard case, and there was a number of murders of women here at the same time, there was a motion passed in the Assembly to develop such a strategy, but since then there has been very little movement on that at all. And Women's Aid Federation Northern Ireland has been leading a campaign on this, because, you know, advocacy around these issues has led us nowhere. There are other areas as well with coercive control.
Just before you move on to the other areas, can I just ask you, so is there no real ability to have a dialogue about the different contexts that violence against women exists in Northern Ireland versus violence against men?
That would be, in a nutshell, it. Yes, you know, it's a limited understanding of equality duties, if we put it like that. And there is, even if you look at, there was publicity around 16 days of action last year, and that was all gender neutral. It's associated with a wider tendency towards gender neutral policy making in Northern Ireland.
And domestic violence strategy, as you said, is explicitly gender neutral.
Explicitly so, yes.
You were going to give another example.
Yes, I was just going to say that in terms of legislation related to violence against women and girls, coercive control isn't fully criminalized here yet. There is legislation that just being royal assent earlier on this year around domestic abuse that goes some way towards that, but not fully. And we don't currently have stalking legislation. There is a protection from stalking bill currently passing through the Assembly, so it will come, but it's not there yet. And you know, that's obviously one of the reasons why the UK hasn't been able to ratify the Istanbul Convention, in addition to, you know, limitations in terms of implementing clear recommendations of CEDAW. There are other examples I could give around childcare. There has never been a childcare strategy. You know, there's issues obviously around reproductive health still.
We've got another witness who's going to talk specifically about reproductive health.
Yeah.
Could you just come back to what's the legislative position in Northern Ireland? So the Equality Act, the 2010 is not enforced in Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
No, that's GB only legislation. So our main piece of equality legislation is the Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act 1998, which imposes a duty on public authorities to have regard to equality of opportunity, and equality between men and women is how it's expressed in that legislation. You know, there are also other pieces of legislation, but they haven't been harmonized into a single body of legislation, and many of them haven't been updated. So, for example, the Sex Discrimination Act is from 1976.
And how did the Good Friday Agreement try and deal with some of those positions on Bill of Rights and so on?
Within the Good Friday Agreement, there was included a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, which would clearly set out rights. Now that hasn't been delivered on 23 years later. There's currently a process that is from the New Decade New Approach Agreement that was reached in January of last year to consider a Bill of Rights, and there is currently an ad hoc committee at the Assembly looking at this. And that's something that we have been advocating for strongly, that Northern Ireland needs a Bill of Rights, because if that had been in place a long time ago, there would have been lots of things that would be different for women. Most importantly, women would have greater representation, greater say in decision making. But from our perspective, and we have been among organizations who gave evidence to the committee, it's about basically codifying rights that are already there. And we would in particular see that as an opportunity to include international obligations, or have due regard to international obligations, because from our perspective, these are rights that are there, because CEDAW has been ratified. Inclusion in domestic legislation would be important. Now, it doesn't, for Northern Ireland, a simple extension of the public sector equality duty doesn't work, because the legislative framework is different, as Rachel just referred to in the previous evidence session. There's different frameworks across the devolved nations, but certainly, the Bill of Rights would offer a basis for including the international obligations in a way that would give justiciability to rights. That's something that has been emphasized by civil society in general, that we need justiciable rights.
And so CEDAW would be an express part of that in your evidence?
That's certainly what we have called for. It is quite complex, but the way we view it, Northern Ireland, like all the other parts of the UK, are bound by these rights. And in the Northern Ireland context, it's about clarifying the rights are for everyone, not only for some people, for some other time, for some reasons.
I just wanted to ask you specifically about something you mentioned in your statement about the failure to make progress in terms of the political paralysis in Northern Ireland. Can you explain what happens on the ground in the last 4 years? What's been happening?
Yeah. I mean, in a nutshell, while the institutions weren't working between 2017 and early 2020, no legislation could be progressed, and no strategies could be delivered. So that in practice, the situation was paralyzed. There was only implementation of strategies that had been implemented and agreed beforehand. And in practice, that meant that things like gender pay gap legislation, which had been drafted in line with the recommendation of the CEDAW 2013 concluding recommendations, couldn't be passed, and it's now in the queue to be the regulations to be approved, but that hasn't, there's a long queue of things that has been held up.
And so if you had CEDAW, you might be able to have a directly enforceable right there, rather than waiting for this piecemeal in implementation of various different provisions.
It certainly would make a big difference, yes.